Hi everyone, welcome to Brick and Block, and joining me this week, I've got an old colleague and peer, Oliver Morris. Hey Ali.
How's it going? Good to see you.
Thank you very much for joining me today. Brilliant that we've sorted this out. Been on my list to talk to for a while now, and obviously we worked together a long time ago on Holbein Gardens, good number of years ago. And you've now actually moved to CBRE, haven't you, in the last couple of years?
Yeah, that's right. I've been at CBRE now for probably coming up 2.5 years now. First year was, I think with any new job, is a lot to take in, and it feels like a very long year for good reasons. And then after the year, for me, it just absolutely flies by. So yeah, 2.5 years and counting.
And it's also been quite interesting because I think prior to you joining CBRE, would it be fair to say that the sustainability team has really grown, hasn't it, around yourself and the rest of your team and peers?
Yeah, absolutely. CBRE, our business, really invested in our ESG consultancy group. So when I joined, I think there was probably between, I want to say 10 and 15. We're now at over 100, and we cover all sorts. It's not just the kind of the sustainable development advisory part of ESG. It's also risk and contamination. It's specifically energy. We have an occupier specific team. We do things around planning and EIA. So yeah, so it's kind of covering everything. We've got a big investor ESG team as well. So yeah, it's really grown. It's really, really exciting actually. Surrounded by incredible professionals, which I'm constantly learning from.
No, it's actually something that I've sort of gathered that a lot of, I think, and you'll have to correct me on this, but it felt like probably say 10 years ago when we were all in the industry, like I remember 10 years ago when we were doing a BREEAM assessment. And it was probably just sort of like one or two people or a couple of people, a handful of people in a sustainability team as part of a, wider consultancy. It really does feel that days have changed where the industry is now, as you quite rightly just mentioned there, you've got different people looking at different things. I'm currently working on a project in London Bridge. I've got a team of almost like 4 or 5 people from a sustainability consultancy team, all looking after this different elements. You've got one person who's looking after the project. You've got a BREEAM assessor, a well assessor. You've got an energy modeling assessor. Got another person looking at the operational energy. And I think probably 10 years ago, we wouldn't have had that element. I don't know. Is that a right way to look at it, perhaps?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it's quite funny you sort of talking about that, and not in my head, I'm thinking, there's too many people on too many people on the project. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the subject matter experts for all kind of aspects of sustainability. Whereas I think maybe 10 years ago, it would be sort of packaged up, and you'd have one person doing doing the whole shebang. So, I mean, actually, funnily enough, 10 years ago is when I started in the industry. So that was when I picked up. I got a job in London. Worked for a environmental consultancy called 8 Associates, which was at the time, I think, quite a small consultancy, certainly compared to what it is now. I don't know the ins and outs, but I think they're a much larger business. But yeah, it was. You mentioned kind of BREEAM. I think that was the sort of the gold standard back then. Because it was the established certification method for the UK and driven by planning policy, which in a sense hasn't actually changed that much. We still have policy that asks for green certification like BREEAM, but I think there's just a recognition now that it doesn't sort of it's not the only thing that constitutes sort of sustainability. BREEAM doesn't equal sustainability, and actually part of what I do day to day is trying to articulate that to our clients and our project teams, who have varying levels of experience of delivering ESG and sustainability on projects. And yeah, so it's part of what I do actually is trying to people away from saying, oh, I'm here and here's the BREEAM assessor. And it's no, I'm not BREEAM assessor. We're the sustainability consultant on the job that looks at a number of different aspects.
Yeah, definitely. I think the sustainability sort of side of things is the role of it has changed. Certainly for us as architects, I think we've had to learn a lot more about what it entails. Once upon a time, it was just about getting the credits, or when Well came in, it was kind of thinking about the features. But I think we as designers have had to think a little bit more holistically about what we're trying to do. And I think that was quite reflective of what we did together when we were working on Holbein Gardens, that it was the brief from Grosvenor on that one was, aim high, show us what we can do with a, classic 80s building, brick masonry building, and, think very strategically, I think, right, with what could be possible with, a building like that, which is quite typical of, a good London stock building. And I think that train of thought, I think, has been, certainly for us as a practice, a big learning curve to rethink how we perhaps once thought about sustainability. And, as you quite rightly said, forget about the certifications, think about all the integral elements, and then, you can then start feeding into things. I mean, you were mentioning about educating clients as well. It feels to me that, at the beginning of a project, you've often got a PM or an architect starting, one of the, first consultants, but actually correct me here, but it also feels that you're also there very early on to agree strategies with the client, whether it's their framework or actually just aspirationally. Do you find that you're there to develop it, or do you find that sometimes clients are now having their own ESG officer exec in the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real mix. So we will often get involved whereby we're acting as almost like mediator between client and project team, where there may be an internal sustainability team of the clients who don't sort of sit on a project day to day, and they're sort of relying on us really to be able to drive the project team, but then feedback to their kind of expert within their team, who then obviously then can report it back up to their superiors and their business. But then there'll be other clients we work with who are very early on in their journey and don't have that internal resource, in which case they really do look to us to kind of work with them to agree a project, or I say a project brief. It starts at the sort of the organizational level to actually identify what does their organization want to drive, what's their USP, I guess, what will they be sort of remembered or seen as in the industry as delivering, whether that's, best in class from an energy perspective, or actually is there more of a focus on the social value, or the biodiversity, greening of buildings. So yeah, there's a real range. I mean, we do, on your point, you mentioned about, you said sort of certification, you said, forget about certification. So we've really moved from, I think, a design for compliant culture into increased vested interest from a number of stakeholders, whether it be the client team, whether it be the investor, whether it be, the end occupier, whether it be the design team themselves, and then also the supply chain. But there's much more are we pushing against an open door, where it's not a nice to have, it's an essential. So we're not, shall we have it, shall we not? It needs to be done, and we need to incorporate it as much as we possibly can. And I think everyone is aware of that. And so it really helps to drive the conversation. And as you say, it is about getting the relevant expertise in at that early stage, who either agree upon and develop whether it be an organizational framework, sustainability framework, or then, and perhaps to apply that framework to a specific project, making sure that obviously everything that should be done is done, but then also being flexible to allow the team's creativity to come to the table with ideas and opportunities to maybe enhance that kind of expected standard. And that really moves us away from, or starts to move us away from, this design for compliance, which has traditionally been wrapped up as part of sort of green certification, into more of a sort of design for performance and kind of verification. And a lot of disclosure requirements that businesses are starting to have to report against is about that ongoing verification. So not just drawing the line in the sand once the project's complete, but actually to go back in and verify that. And that's where you start getting things like, the NABERs, the energy efficiencies, and the verification processes around that. The certifications themselves, I mean, they do serve a purpose, and they do have they do provide that foundation level, which I think a lot of people can understand. It's a language that a lot of people understand. But that we are, I guess, I think personally, we're sort of at risk of this sort of certification fatigue, where you have so many different certifications that you could be looking to pursue, that it becomes a complete myriad. And actually, what we really try to avoid is to sort of like, targeting something for target's sake. That's why the project is so important, is to get the clients, get the buy-in from the team and actually say, well, what is it that you actually want to do? And often that question and that listing exercise, you come out with a completely different result than us going in and saying, right, these are all the certifications you should look at. Another building is looking at doing 3, 4, 5 of them. You want to align with them, right? Well, off you go. And actually thinking, what do we need that? Is it a value add proposition? Is it a market expectation? Do we have prospective tenants, and are they going to actually want to our building where they have limitations on their fit out to the point where it actually is detrimental to their experience of the building? Do we not actually think about more practical ways of incorporating measures of sustainability that maybe don't align directly with loads of different certifications? That design for performance, I think, it's slow and there's a lot of work to do on it, but we're getting there.
Yeah, it's really interesting though, because we constantly review this in the practice, because there's been some interesting articles in the industry where agencies have, the likes of CBRE, in terms of agency feedback, we've certainly felt that agents are feeding back to us and to the client saying, if you want a top tier tenant, the big corporates, then they have got big ESG requirements. And you, to some degree, is a bit of a tick box. They want the best of the best. They want a high EPC. They want to make sure that it is BREEAM. If it's good fit out, then they may also want the well side of things, so that they know that if it's one of those plug and play, schemes, then they want to know that what they're coming into is actually already meeting that requirements or is well enabled. Then they can come in and do that. So there certainly seems to be a bit of a feedback from the agency side of things that actually it is met well, and sort of going forward, as more and more companies have their own ESG requirements, their own targets. But Gazettas have also made our own targets for 2030 and 2050. We're on a net zero journey ourselves. And, we're 55 people. We're, a medium-sized company, but even a medium-sized company needs to have our own targets, and we've got that. And it does feel like perhaps that there's sort of a scale
Mm.
that you've got, the big corporates that do need lots and lots of things, but it is very interesting when you mention the point about, can tenants actually sign up to doing certain things?
Mm.
Um, and does it become too restrictive? Which I think perhaps is true when it comes to, say, a small or medium sized company. And an SME, I think, will struggle in some scenarios. And I wonder whether they sort of will lean towards plug and play,
Mm.
this fit out method, when they know that actually the landlord is going to do all of these things for them and they don't have to worry about those certifications and stuff to back them
Mm.
up, or actually whether that's going to put them off in some ways.
Mm.
I don't know whether you've seen a differing scale with the different types of clients that you've dealt with on that.
Um, what I can say is that there's certainly we're certainly seeing an emerging discrepancy in the organizational targets of landlords and occupiers.
Mhm.
In that, what I mean by that is that a lot of landlords are bound by certain disclosure requirements. I mentioned disclosures before, so things like
Yeah.
task for climate related financial disclosures, SFDR. I'm not going to go through all the acronyms because I'm going to content until I think. And a lot of those are aligned to delivering, say, a net zero carbon economy by 2050,
Mm.
or slightly further, slightly before, maybe 2040. Whereas occupiers, a lot of their net zero carbon aspirations are actually pulled forward to, say, 2030. So you immediately have a bit of a discrepancy between, say, what a landlord is, potentially providing, developing to make sure that they meet their own kind of organizational targets, and then actually a tenant, prospective occupier coming in, and the building is actually not fit for purpose for their own net zero, which has maybe been pulled slightly forward. So that's I find that really interesting. We did at the CBRE did some research last year on that, sort of a global engagement survey, and it quite clearly showed that there is a sort of a pattern of landlords tend to be towards the sort of 2050 target in the round, whereas occupiers tend to bring that forward.
Mm.
In terms of kind of types of client, I mean, you mentioned kind of agency, they can be our greatest ally and are also our biggest blocker for implementing ESG. Just in that it's projects that maybe go against the grain and move away from traditional kind of design. We think about the raised access floor
Yeah.
conversation of probably about 5 years ago,
Yeah.
where no one was going to put in reuse raised access flooring unless it was in, a refurbished office space in Shoreditch.
Yeah.
It was always got to be new. Whereas now, I mean, I know that the demand completely outstrips the supply. I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
Every project I've gone has got to be reuse raised access flooring. And so that's really changed. But that, I think, really started from being able to articulate to agents that, prospective tenants aren't going to be walking around and it being a shiny new office. Actually, it's going to be a bit of a floor. And the reason for that is, well, you're carpeting it anyway. And actually the embodied carbon associated with that is significantly less. So they really do play a big part in conversations, and we are really trying to engage. I mean, obviously CBRE has a big, massive agency.
They do. Yeah.
So engaging with my wider teams to work through and talk to them, because they are essentially the ones that then will go out and advise and discuss with clients what the market expectation is. And I think that really sort of, just thinking more broadly, that really is an opportunity to kind of speed up the delivery of buildings within, say, the UK, within cities, to align with some of our higher sustainability aspirations.
Have you found, you mentioned there's an education piece and then a communication piece through yourself, through the client, through agency, down to the tenant. Have you found sort of occasions where perhaps, as you have quite rightly said, say that you're teaming up with your agency department and you're also there sort of explaining the scheme to a prospective tenant saying, here's what it can do. And maybe there's a bit of an education piece to say, because I guess not every tenant, and a tenant could literally be anyone from any industry. They may or may not know anything about sustainability apart from, oh crap, I've got to do something because the entire industry is moving towards, net zero. I don't know what to do. Then the agency can go, okay, well, you can do this, this, and this. Oh, by the way, here's Ollie. Ollie can tell you a little bit more about like how it is. Do you find that there's strategies coming through where you're having to also speak to tenants, or is that something that's more on the agency side?
I wouldn't say it's, it may be something that's being done in the industry. I personally am not party to those sort of conversations, other than in instances where we're, not in direct communication, but we are preparing information packs that take out the technical details of the well building standard, for example, but highlight in kind of layman's terms the features of the building that support a healthy workspace. So, whether it be to do with the ventilation and the opportunities, open windows, and the controls that have been included, the user controls, the thermal comfort, the features that allow people to be able to manage their own sort of spaces, and the sort of intelligent building features. So we are getting more involved in that, I guess, all the marketing aspect, and therefore the education aspect. But from a direct kind of conversations, that's not something yet. But I mean, I think probably the next step, potentially, my agency colleagues do a fantastic job of talking to up to the industry, whether it be landlord or occupier, whoever it is that they're working with, in expressing what is required or what what would be the expectation. But that is only based on what information is available, and often that is around we call it a kind of common market metrics. So BREEAM certification, the EPC rating, where you can quite clearly compare building A to building B. Embodied carbon is a slightly more tricky kind of metric, because we're only just getting a handle on how to actually assess it in a standardized, consistent, robust way. And data that has come, has been presented previously up until very recently has been all over the shop. And everyone's getting fixated on the intensity figures, which is based on an assessment that may or not be comparable to another assessment. So very difficult to be able to communicate why this building has a lower embodied carbon intensity figure than this building, without kind of going into the details of exactly what was included within that assessment. And we are getting there. There's guidance on that now, but or more reputable, sort of robust guidance. But it's trying to sort of get to a point where you can confidently kind of assess different performance metrics that are sort of fairly consistent across buildings, and there's opportunity. There's no sort of area of ambiguity.
Do you think? Because I think 5 years ago when we started whole buying, I remember you saying this to the team, that it was quite tricky to agree a principle for embodied carbon. I mean, since then, I think RICS have got some guidance, UKGBC have got guidance, Letty have done some fantastic work out there. I think you've also been part of a few of these working groups yourself. Do you think we will be able to agree a standard in the industry, or is it going to be? I appreciate it's very nuanced, but do you think we can get to a point where everyone will agree something? Because it still feels to me that it's a bit like up in air, here and there.
there's a lot of work being done in this space. You know, the attention that's been given to embodied carbon. You know, embodied carbon is probably a few years behind the operational carbon in terms of the design performance gap. You know, 10
Mhm.
years ago, when I got into the industry, it was all about the design performance gap of operational energy. So, you know, using EPCs as our methods for assessing or estimating energy consumption, and then realizing that actually in use it's actually completely different, which is under,
Yeah.
given the crude nature of EPCs. There's been some work on that to try and eradicate or minimize that through TN54 and now NABERs. But I think embodied carbon is now going through a similar kind of sort of approach or route where initially it was lack of data. We're starting to get this data, but the data is not, or is possibly not, comparable against each other. But you're right. I mean, the RICS has brought out a great new piece of guidance, professional statement, which is an updated version on the previous one, which was 2017. So up until that update, everyone, a huge reliance was placed on that 2017 guidance, which is the sort of the first piece of guidance really that could be referred to. So the update's great. I mean, there's a load of stuff in there that helps provide a level of consistency. And I think we are steadily moving into a position where we can quantify sort of embodied carbon emissions consistently across the industry. There are still some areas that we do struggle with. A lot of the processes around the transparency of materials and the impacts of those materials. We have environmental product declarations, which 10 years ago, would hardly find any. Whereas now we're in a much better position, but there's still gaps, particularly around, and I think everyone who works in this space knows, but sort of the mechanical engineering, public health, electrical services really struggle because environmental product declarations are generally sort of certified against major building elements with concrete, steel, timber, insulation, not the kind of composite material, not the composite kind of equipment, which is very difficult to sort of dissect. And the process of an EPD is very, very long as well. So it can take, I say years, a year and more, plus the cost of it to get it actually certified. So yeah, there's still definitely some gaps. And I think also people are starting to realize not so much to hang their hat on some of the numbers that are flying around, because actually we're only just starting to understand the verified emissions, embodied carbon emissions of developments as built. Similarly to say NABERs, where there's a lot of design performance ratings going out around 5-star, 5.5-star, 6-star. There aren't actually that many buildings that have been verified in use. The NABERS Energy for Offices kind of verification rating. And I think, this next period is going to be very much understanding just how far that design performance gap is from a possibly NABERS perspective, but more sort of what we're talking about is more sort of embodied carbon, I think.
Do you think EPCs will fall away? And it's probably been asked before, but do you think EPCs will fall away and we'll sort of more look at a NABERS rating? Or do you think it's still some role?
I think the possible challenges with that is the skills gap potentially to deliver something like NABERS. It's a very, very detailed assessment and is very, very quite resource intense and requires to do that. An EPC is given the requirements to kind of for modeling. It can be picked up quite easily, or without that same level of specialism. And I think possibly cost and time to get to the point where people could do that. You might find you end up monopolizing. Yeah, there's a couple of consultancies that end up monopolizing the industry from a NABERS perspective, because others aren't able to deliver that level of service. So I mean, I'd like to see it because it's a much more robust way of understanding building performance, and it's then verified. I guess with EPCs, you could look at, obviously public buildings, look at decks to display energy certificates, which is based on actual energy consumption. And then you've also got sort of TM54 methodology, which does they've done quite a lot of work to try and make sure that aligns with the sort of design performance method. So I think we are moving to a point where, transparency is key, and sort of consistent reporting is key. But I do think EPC is probably going to stay around for a while, just because of that. It provides a basis similar to sort of environmental certification. Provides that basis that people understand.
Yeah.
People understand that A is, in simple terms, that A should be better than B should be better than C.
Yeah.
In practice, possibly not every time, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess as well, when you think about sort of the corporate world to sort of homeowners, I mean, I can't remember what my APC is. My flat is actually, it's all right. I think it's a B, might be C. But it's exactly what you said. I think it's a much more accessible standard that I think the general public will understand. But it does feel like perhaps, certainly from what I've seen in the last couple of years, that in the corporate world, but in industry where people are working in buildings, that you do need a bit more of a stringent assessment that can then be backed up by their ESG ambitions and goals. And they probably need to be a bit more stringent. I think in our homes, we obviously want to do the best that we can, but that's also relative, isn't it? I mean, I'm in a new build flat. It's pretty decent. I'm pretty warm. It's great, good insulation, but it's not passive house standard, but it's something that we understand, right?
Yeah. I mean, I know that there's, I know that the design performance and NABERs is currently sort of office only, but I know that they are looking at consulting on the sort of the residential aspect of it. So because there's always been a challenge with, well, how do you sort of apply as robust an assessment for offices as you do for resi. So there is some work being done in that space, and we have. I mean, there's a load of guidance that's being, and I think actually one of the things that is a challenge is to try and understand what piece of guidance supersedes another piece of guidance. And actually there's a lot of initiatives working on similar kind of work streams. And what's great about, say, I think the net zero carbon building standard is that it's a sort of a collaboration. I don't particularly like that word because it's used so much, but it is a collaboration of loads of industry initiatives and working groups to develop a sort of a standard. I think that kind of work will really help to move away from, say, such a crude method of assessing a building, but it still has the EPC still have a place in our industry. Banks use it to offer out or assess buildings that are greener than others, and they give you preferential rates on mortgages. So there's we are still very much relying on information like EPCs to be able to differentiate between buildings. I think that'll be quite, I'm not going to say categorically, but there's probably going to be quite a slow process to move away from.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think you're probably right on that. I mean, when you start thinking about how much an EPC is used and understood by the general public, I often find, and I think we discussed this a while ago, that you've got to think about, it's quite easy for us in the professional world, in the professional consultancy bubble, to get sort of sucked into certain things, but to, I think this was picked up in one of the Letty working groups meetings, one of the early on ones, that you have to try and make it accessible to as many people as possible, whether it's not just office space, whether it's retail or residential. And residential could be a block of flats, which, I'm in right now, or it could be a semi-detached, home.
Mm.
And it applies on a scale of differing, elements, but we do need to create a baseline, which I think, clearly EPC seems to do.
Mm.
And that I think it sort of creates an interesting sort of paradigm, I think, of, those who want to really try and push the standards, which, are large. If you're spending, 50, 60 million pounds on an office refurbishment, then you want to get your money's worth and make sure that it is hitting a level.
Mm.
But one thing, I was sort of taking this thread on one more step, but do you think greenwashing as a process has probably gone down in recent years, or do you think it's still around?
I think you'll find it's still very much around. Unfortunately, there are just I say there are just different ways of greenwashing. I think years ago, who was it? They coined the sort of the 7 sins of greenwashing. Kind of going through, it's not just about saying you do something and you're not doing it. It's also possibly not saying something that you're doing because you're worried that possibly it doesn't, it doesn't stack up well against peers. False information, relying too much on certain kind of characteristics of what you're doing that actually don't give a full picture. So replacing processes to minimize the use of certain material, reducing plastic use or something in an office to replace with paper. Okay, great. But actually you're not reducing waste. You're just creating waste of another material. So that's a nuanced example, but I do think greenwashing still exists very much so. I think the increasing disclosure and tightening of regulations and the public and industry scrutiny that is emerging, and the poor performance now more than ever is essentially can be related to cost and operational cost. People are much more interested now that we have it just entered. We entered an energy crisis, cost of living crisis. People are much more concerned and interested about the kind of impact on pocket. So I think
Absolutely.
So I think there's less opportunity to present statements without sort of the validation. I think there's a lot more scrutiny of that. And I do think that some of the disclosure requirements and things like, the Science-Based Targets Initiative that businesses sign up to, their corporate aspirations, you do need to report against that. And you do need to, focus on reduction, as opposed to, a small proportion being allowed for sort of say offsetting. So you do have to make kind of absolute change rather than we'll pay our way out kind of thing.
I mean, interestingly, Bar Gazellas have also signed up for science-based targets, and interestingly, Jonathan, our director at Bar Gazellas, who's heading up our ESG side of things, he was interestingly feeding back to the office that, because obviously we have to track everything, whether it's transport or even today, like I'm working from home. So I'm committing a sin today because I'm double counting myself, because, you're still using energy at the office, and I'm creating energy by working from home, which is really ridiculous when you start thinking about it. But that's the way that it is, which is really odd. Because you think, oh, I'm at home, so it's not affecting it, but actually I'm working from home, so it sort of does count. It does feel that I think there's so much more nuance to it to track and to assess. I think you often sort of don't realize how complicated it is, which I've certainly realized it.
Yeah, and look, I think it's I say this a lot, I probably say it too much, but this like the pursuit of perfection should not be the enemy for good, right?
Mm,
And a lot of this is I mean, the time for change is now. We know we are in trouble. I think, the climate emergency is not going away and it's getting worse. And like, don't read the news if you want kind of any sort of positive, update on where we're heading. But I think just the awareness and the mechanisms through things like the Science Based Targets Initiative and other disclosures for bigger businesses, plus the kind of the emerging market expectation, the scrutiny, and then sort of interrogation of statements and some of the accolades that are being sort of presented. That I think is really moving us in the right direction, for sure. Whether it's quick enough, well, I say whether it's quick enough, it's not quick enough. But there is certainly progress. I think
mm,
it's easier, I think, to call someone out now for not doing something than maybe, say 10 years ago, because of the attention it's been given and because there's less wiggle room, where people are having to sign up, businesses are having to sign up to these. There's still definite greenwashing, no doubt about it.
mm.
But you're finding more, it's being called up more and more, not just a bit of environment, but just, kind of
Yeah.
different industries, are being called out, and it's a good thing.
Well, it gives me a nice segue into my final question for you, because it feels like I could probably talk to you about this for a couple of hours easily. But if money was no object for you, what would be the one thing that you think that you could click your fingers and change immediately about climate change?
That's such a good question, and so difficult to think of something. I want to come up with a really nice sort of sound, like one sentence soundbite, and that's not going to happen, I'm afraid. If you know me, and I don't do sort of sound bites. I do 5 minute diatribes. I think I think we need to really look at the further and rapid investment in infrastructure to allow sort of a rapid decarbonisation. I know it's not particularly fancy, but I think that really is a key, to us getting to a point of net zero emission, but then everything else that goes along with it, the like air quality aspects and feeding into the sort of species kind of extinction. I think it all relates together, and I think that the decarbonisation of global industry is going to be key to that. So I think, heavy investment in infrastructure to allow for that just rapid transition, would be my call, I think.
I mean, I definitely agree that infrastructure is one of the key elements to unlock a lot of things, whether it's there's so much. I was talking about electric cars in the office yesterday, and I had polarizing views on whether it's good or not. I mean, I like the concept. I'd like to get one myself, and then
Mhm.
not burn fossil fuels as a basic principle. I think everyone's okay with that. The issue then is when you start thinking about batteries, about making air, of getting rid of it and putting new batteries in, then it starts to like complicate matters. And, one of my colleagues was saying, well, imagine if you clicked your fingers. And I sort of also asked him the same question about electric cars. And he was like, well, is there actually enough power in the UK grid? Suddenly everyone had electric cars. I'm not sure that that actually would be the case. So exactly. So it's interesting about infrastructure because, I get the tube every day. That's great. Electric cars, that's fantastic. But, then you still got planes, right? How are you going to sort that out? You've got
Mhm.
massive ships. Shipping is much better,
Mhm.
than
Mhm.
some transports, but it still burns a lot of, fossil fuels. So it does feel like from a transport side of things, that's a big thing. Our energy consumption for our homes. I've tried to make an effort with my energy in my flat where I've picked a green tariff with my utilities provider.
Mhm.
So yes, there's probably things that we could all do, but it does feel that it's quite a balance, and there's developing countries around the world who, whilst they would like to do green things, sometimes, and I think this is the tricky thing, is that economy wise, it doesn't lend itself to do that immediately. They can start doing it.
Mm.
And I know politically there's a big discussion about whether developing countries should be able to, use fossil fuels. It's a little bit more accessible than spending money on big infrastructure, renewable schemes to do that. So, yeah, who knows? That'd be amazing.
That's the part. Yeah. I mean, that's the sort of purpose of sort of say transition funds. And I mean, we're creatures of habit, and we tend to just carry on a lifestyle. So we need the sort of support that goes on behind the scenes, so that when I turn the heating on in my flat, yes, I'll sure I choose a green energy tariff, and it's an electric kind of heating system. But that behind the scenes, we know that the grid has decarbonized to the point where actually that energy that I'm using is solely renewable. And I think that without that, people will just carry on. The electric car is an interesting point. There's obviously a huge amount of embodied carbon associated with that, but it's a decision of when to buy potentially the car. If you don't have a car and you're buying a car, well, or is it that you're replacing your old car, or is there's a few parameters to go on? But yeah, anyway, that's my sort of not particularly exciting thought. If I did have all that money, would I do that? I don't know. I mean, I probably would. Yeah, I probably would.
Nice. But thank you very much for your time. I know you're very, very busy. So I really do appreciate you making the time to talk to me today. And for those listening, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Do check out CBRE, do check out Ollie on LinkedIn. And if you have been, thank you very much for listening in, and do subscribe, like, and share all of these elements. And I'll see you in the next one. So thank you very much, everyone.